Sketchbrains India is dedicated to empowering youth through employability focused initiatives, industry learning experiences, and community knowledge sharing sessions. In collaboration with Telangana Academy for Skill and Knowledge, we are pleased to present Sunday with Sketchbrains, a career awareness and knowledge sharing session designed for students to prepare to transition from campus into the corporate world. The session today is Analytics as a Career, and our speaker is Mr. Snehith Allamraju, Director Analytics, Dun and Bradstreet. In today's session, you'll discover the diverse opportunities in analytics, gain industry insights, and learn how to build a successful career by bridging the gap between academic learning and the corporate world. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Amina. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. I know it's Sunday morning, so it essentially shows the dedication that all of you have to learning, to upskilling. I would like to thank Sketchbrains and Task, for having me here today. Let me quickly share my screen, and then let's see how we can go from there. Let me know when you see my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay. So today we are going to talk about analytics as a career. And I'm assuming that all of you here are students who are still in campus, maybe in second or third year, or maybe all years. We'll kind of talk about what the scenario today is, what you can do as a student, and I'll probably try to interweave what my story has been through my 19 years of career. So one thing that I remember, and again 2007 is when I started off my first job, when I passed out of college, right when I passed out of college. And one thing that I've noticed over the last 19 years is that careers are never linear, right? So I started off with Infosys. I came from an electronics and communications background, from JNTU, and then working through Infosys, putting in the hard hours, doing everything around data warehousing, SQL, SAP, is what I was doing at Infosys. I did get the opportunity to move to the US at the beginning of my career. So around 3.5, 4 years is when I moved to the US, working for some clients of Infosys as a team lead. And then I quit my job there and moved to another company in the US, called Noble Biocare, doing data engineering, business intelligence, for the product-based company. Um, and again, there was where I learned the tricks of the trade, because working for a client versus working for a product company, it gives you a completely different exposure with regards to what is it that you need to know. It inculcates your business thinking essentially, as to what is it that requires that is required from a solving a business problem standpoint, because that's eventually what analytics are for, and that's something that I will reiterate every now and then in today's session. um, was there in the US for almost 7 years. Then I moved back to India, worked for the same company, and then I got my advanced analytics degree from Indian School of Business in business analytics. That opened up opportunities, for me to, because the world was moving towards data science, machine learning, and that helped me get the opportunity to lead data science, machine learning, IoT projects, at my product-based company firm. Having worked there for almost 11.5 years across geographies, leading teams in India, in Zurich, in the US, and then moved to RSM, which was a middle market assurance, tax and consulting firm. So I grew the analytics team there, So moved into more of a director kind of a role, leading analytics teams, growing the practice locally here for the last 3 years. And I just recently, joined Dun and Bradstreet, which is a data company. So um, from Infosys being a service-based company to Noble Care or Invista being a product company to RSM being a consulting firm, to Dun and Bradstreet, which is data being the product itself, right? The path was never straight, and it is not going to be, for all of you as well, and especially in this today's ever-changing world, the career is not linear, and that's one thing that I would want all of you to remember. Why analytics, right? People might be wondering, hey, I want to be going to an analytics or a data career, but if you look at the ever changing market, right, 20 years ago, uh, opportunities or jobs out there were dominated by service based firms, India based service based firms. The whole concept of working in big campuses, going on site, working for clients, etc., was the prevalent role or job. And a lucky few, did get to work with product based companies. Fast forward to today, in 2026, today we are driven by the world of GCCs or global capability centers. We have almost 2000 plus GCCs operating in India. More than 2 million professionals are working for GCCs. New jobs in the market are dominated by GCCs. Again, majority of the GCCs come to set up shop here to work on analytics, COAs, data, AI kind of work. Hyderabad, if you're joining from Hyderabad, has say 20 to 25% of the India's GCC footprint. So we do have new GCCs opening store every week as we speak. Hyderabad does have a very strong BFSI, pharma, analytics tilt, but there are other industries that are also catching up, right? And if you look at talent, right, analytics practitioners are the digital economy that these companies need. So there's an ever growing need for professionals, whether experienced or whether freshers, to fill in that gap, right? So we are, or the industry, especially from a data analytics standpoint. And again, when I say data analytics, I'll encapsulate everything from data specific roles to analytics specific roles to AI specific roles, right? So that industry is kind of scaling at an unprecedented rate, right? And especially for engineering students, and more importantly for third and fourth years, this is essentially your pathway. This is your runway to which is quite wide open. It is for you to get onto it and get that acceleration, get that tailwind behind you essentially. So again, that's where the industry is going, and so there are ample opportunities. Now, what does analytics actually mean, right? So let's take one of the most used apps, I would say, especially if you're a student, and not just students, even if you're a working professional, one of the most important apps, right? Why does Swiggy say recommend one restaurant before another, right? And if you think about it, from a data perspective, right, you'll get to understand that there are five primary disciplines that essentially support this business model. And again, this is just one app, one business model. Scale that up to the larger enterprises, and but it still remains the same, right? So when you talk about Swiggy, they have data collection. They collect data around all new restaurants that are offering their services on Swiggy, the menu, the customer information, all of that is data essentially, right? And then how does Swiggy as a company engineer that data, engineer their pipelines to serve near real time or even real time specific use cases. How do they build analytics, not just for you as a customer, but for the restaurants, or for the product managers, to understand demographics, to understand, okay, which areas are where the orders come from, what time of the day, how the spike looks like, etc., etc., right? So again, there are analytics around it, right? And then there is machine learning. So there is models that go through essentially to recommend, say, one restaurant before the another. And then the overall packaging itself, how does the company package all of this into an app, all of this into an ecosystem, that can be seamlessly used, day in, day out, right? So if you think about it, every product, every company, is using analytics, at the as the underlying layer. So it's not just, one industry, it's an engine, I would say, in every industry. You take BFSI, you take, life sciences, you take retail, you take e-commerce, you take Q-commerce or quick commerce, you take the likes of the Netflixes, or the payment gateways of the world. You take healthcare, manufacturing, IPL, right? It's data analytics is the engine that is driving every industry, and that should kind of tell you why choosing it as a career gives you those ample opportunities. And again, choosing is the easier part, right? What is important is that how do you prepare yourself for being successful in that industry. How do you configure, I would say, your mindset from a college going student to a data professional, right? And that's something that we'll probably talk about a little bit today. So again, if you look at it from my perspective, if you look at my own career right now, I started off being, say, a data analyst, a developer, answering business questions, using tools, technologies, etc., right? And then what I kind of realized is that, hey, at the end of the day, tools and technologies keep changing, they keep evolving. Back then, SAP was out there, at least for me as a career, that was one of the I got lucky that I got into SAP as a career. But again, tools have evolved, and so me being receptive to the platform also helped me, right? So curiosity is something that you need to always have. So whether it is being a data analyst, and then I moved on to answering business questions, because remember, I was in a product based company, so I had to understand what, say, a customer service representative needed, or I had to understand, okay, how can I use data to answer question that someone who was on the factory shop floor needed to understand, to be better, to be efficient. I needed to understand the data or the nuances, or what went wrong, for me to be able to respond to a sales representative as to why he did not get a bonus that specific month, right? So understanding the data and how that connects to the business process is something that I inculcated. And then of course building pipelines to get all of the data, because I worked with companies where there are multiple data sources, and everything was being consolidated, and each of them used their own specific platform or technology, right? um, and then as my role evolved, moving from descriptive as in more backward looking as to what happened, to more prescriptive, especially when I did my IoT or advanced analytics team based work, right? Helping companies being more forward looking rather than backward looking. Basically building models that predict, that classify, that helps companies to understand where to focus on, rather than looking behind and say, why is it that happened, right? And then of course automation is, it's ever evolving. Today we call it AI. Back then, you know RPA was the big thing, or automation was the big thing, right? And then the common thread, or like a horizon, if you think each one of them being like verticals, there is a horizontal that comes cuts through across all of them, is having that consulting mindset, having a leadership mindset wherein you take ownership of the task, you ask the right questions, you try to understand how a problem can have multiple solutions and how each solution can have multiple pathways to the same solution, right? So imbibing that into my thought process as and when I moved along, that's something that I have learned. And I think you know once you are into analytics as a career, this is something that will definitely help you, having that ownership mindset, having that consulting mindset, asking the right questions, and questioning the status quo as well, right? Not just uh, answering why or how, but also why not, right? Why can't you just implement this, or why was something implemented this way, right? Or why are you defining a specific metric as ABC and why not XYZ, right? Those That mindset helps in building your analytics career. And if you look at it, there are students who come to me when I go to meetups, speak at meetups, etc., and they kind of ask me, Snehith, how do I get started, right? So that is a very easy but also a very subjective question, to be quite honest, right? Because everyone needs to build that foundation, and that is the easiest answer. But what that foundation is, right? Again, foundation has multiple facets to it, right? But if you look at a common denominator across any analytics role, any database role, right? One thing that has been the case few years ago and will continue and has continued to be the case um, since then or even today is the foundation layer, right? Again, it goes broad, but it is basically, if you think about, if you're constructing a building, right, that is, those are your pillars on which your strong foundation stands, right, or your building stands, right? So being comfortable with data, writing SQL or understanding SQL, um, working with data in Excel, cleaning data up, or trying to find anomalies, using the tools. Again, Power BI and Tableau are just tools. They are just for you to do exploratory data analysis, right? But that foundation of understanding the data, transforming or playing around with the data to based upon converting that business question to a SQL statement. So understanding SQL or programming, I would say, generally SQL or Python, I think, can you can interchange them as how you want, or Lang. I think nowadays Golang is also something that is taking a lot of precedence. And then of course presenting the data. Those three, I think, continue to be the foundation on the analytics skill pyramid. As you move up, right, the core layer, which is, I think, every company today, of course, expects you as an analytics or a data professional to have that core foundation and be strong at it. And again, when I say strong, getting a certification doesn't mean strong, right? So we will talk about a little bit about what that means. So building that core layer, again, I think most of the engineering students do have probability theory and statistical or probabilistic statistics, etc. I know that's also something that is important because right. And then Python, of course, is required, especially when you take the data, you massage it, you clean it, transform it, or you pull the data using Excel or SQL or whatever that is, right? But if you have to do massaging, you can do it in SQL. But nowadays, Python is the common denominator across, say all cloud platforms or all, AI specific, tools, for instance, right? So having basic intermediate understanding of Python, I think, is necessary. And then the cloud, right? Exposed to at least one cloud in depth, and then understanding the stack. And I kind of call it the T model, right? If you look at the alphabet T, right? If you look at each cloud platform on the horizontal, you need to understand how they fit adjacent, side by side. What one service in, say, AWS, what is the equivalent in Azure, what's the equivalent in GCP, how is Snowflake different, what is the competitor of Snowflake. I think awareness is important. So that's the wide T, right? But the depth is, you need to choose one or two cloud platforms and go deep in it, from infrastructure, from services, from data specific services. Understanding or getting a hands-on work experience on them, or playing around on them, is essential, right? And one good thing, I always mention this, when I and my classmates from engineering, when we speak to each other, we kind of wonder, hey, back then we didn't have companies who were giving out free cloud credits, because cloud was just starting. Nowadays, every student gets such good um, free stuff, from technology providers or platform providers, because they look at you to be the next generation of experts, right? So utilize that, make use of the student benefits that each of these providers or platforms provide, and start playing around, start getting your hands dirty with it, right? And then, of course, the advanced layer, right? Understanding data engineering, understanding, say, medallion model, understanding building pipelines, batch based, streaming based, understanding how to deal with structured or semi-structured or unstructured data. What do they actually mean, right? What kind of data sources fall into them, and how do you process that data into a cloud, or how do you extract information, all of that, right? And then, for someone who, again, there's also something that most students ask me, AI is taking over, would we still be relevant, right? We are relevant, we will be relevant, if you think of AI, it is a high performance, prediction engine. That's how I look at it, essentially, right? So understanding the concepts around machine learning, understanding how generative AI works, um, this will be, of course, the advanced layer, right? So again, every advanced skill or layer needs a core layer. Every core layer needs a foundation layer, right? The multiplier, of course, at all of them is, say, a business understanding. Remember, any tool, any technology, anything that you do, or any company, ultimately they want you to solve a business problem. They need you to understand what the business is solving, what is the business problem, how is your solution adding value, right? That's all it comes down to, essentially, right? It's all about, sometimes it's all about finding the right numbers, which numbers actually matter to your company, right? So understanding those KPIs, understanding what numbers are relevant, for your business. If you're working for a pharma company, if you're working for a uh, fintech startup, if you're working for, I don't know, like a service-based company or a client, right? Knowing which numbers you're working with matters. Knowing which business you are and what are the key metrics in that, essentially matters, right? So I would say, as students, focus on the foundation and the core. The advanced will follow through, because again, advanced is something that you need to pick up as you go, right? It's like a to go, it's like a parcel, essentially, right? But foundation and core are non-negotiable, especially when you go to interviews. And what are the skills that companies are actually hiring for? Again, you may have these shiny new titles like forward deployed engineer, or AI engineer, or ML ops or AI ops engineers, etc., right? Look, as a student, I know, as a fresher, right, if you do not get in the technical skills that we talked about earlier, SQL, Python, Excel, Power BI, cloud, AI skills, or understanding entry into the company to even get into that role might be difficult, right? Again, there might be some AI native companies who might be looking for fresh talent who have worked on, say, the rags of the world. That's fine as well, but that's not the majority, right? Um, think about it this way, right? You may be technically sound, you may be technically very strong, you may have vibe coded yourself to, say, top of leaderboards in Kaggle or hacker rank related competitions, right? But if you're unable to communicate what you did, if you are unable to solve a business problem, if you are unable to remember, I talked about approaching a solution or a problem in multiple ways. If you're not able to do that, you are setting yourself up for failure, right? So again, technical skills are just, I would say, 30 to 40%. You may write a very advanced 400 line SQL to get the data out, but if you don't understand what that output is, if you are unable to communicate that, you know, you're not a good data analyst. You're just a good, SQL developer or a SQL writer, and AI can do that now, right? So where are you adding value? That's where you're adding value. The business skills, the storytelling, understanding the data, how it connects to the different aspects, right? Then, of course, there are some, professional or personal traits, I would call them, right? Especially when you get into corporate setup or into a company or into your role, right? Of course, being professional, being curious is, and having that teamwork mindset is non-negotiable. You need to have those. But inculcating a leadership mindset, and when I say leadership mindset, if you were the owner of the company or if you were the owner of the client, that you are working with, how would you do that? Would the solution that you built be sufficient enough for you, right? And what other way, can would I expect a solution, from whoever I am employing to do stuff for me, right? If you are a customer and you are taking services from, say, Urban Clap or whoever that is, right? You expect minimal level of service, right? So the clients expect the same thing, or your lead or your manager or your CEO expects the same thing from you, right? So having that leadership mindset and tuning your solutions accordingly, always helps. And then, of course, continuous learning, right? If you look at my own specific career, right, I've done across my 19 years, I've done many certifications in every technology or platform that I've worked with, Azure, Power BI, SAP, Business Objects, Snowflake, Tableau. So I hold those certifications, but so those are like intermediary mile markers, if you want to call that, right? But if you want to think of rest stops, if you look from, you start from a city, you have intermediary mile markers, and then you have a rest stop in between before your destination, right? So those mile markers are for me, the way I look at it is, every 3 to 5 years, I kind of invest in getting a certification or a degree, which is more long term rather than just specific, certificate for that specific technology, right? So the way I did my and advanced management program in business analytics from ISB, that was also one thing, because it was 10 years since I passed out of college and I had to keep going, right? So yeah, being able to communicate, having that learning mindset, having that leadership or ownership mindset is always helpful. That's the skills that companies might not ask you a question about, but they are already judging or evaluating you, when you're in the interview, right? So if you have two candidates with equal skills, which is highly likely these days, right? One who can explain the insights clearly to a VP wins every time. As I mentioned, right? You can write 400 line SQL code, but if you're unable to know what the data is, doesn't help you. Now, another thing that I have seen, again, I've gone to multiple engineering colleges locally here, and speaking about career aspirations, building careers, etc. Right? There's always, and I'm also part of the board of studies, for a couple of campuses. You'll always see that your curriculum that is set versus what the industry is expecting. There's always a gap, no matter how private your university is and how uh, you know how rigorously they are updating their curriculum. It is set in stone, the curriculum is set in stone, but the industry keeps moving forward, right? And that's a gap that it's up to you to fill that gap, right? Because again, let's be honest, your colleges or your campuses can only arrange for hackathons or conferences and stuff like that. But if you are not stepping up and volunteering, or in attending it or learning from it, you're falling behind, right? So especially when you look at campuses, right, the kind of data sets that you might be working at, if you are in AIML, if you're in CSE, if you're in data science related courses, especially, they are very clean. They are ready to use data sets. So don't just think that, oh, I did this project in Colab, I did this Kaggle data set, yeah, I got good accuracy. I think I'm a good data person. You might be good, but it's not the real test. Let me put it that way, right? And most of those data sets usually have one right answer, or all approaches lead to one right answer, which is kind of known because it is a beaten to death problem. Many batches before you have done it, many batches after you will continue to do it, right? And then again, let's be honest, when you are still in college, you are talking about grades, assignments, you have fixed deadlines, you have exams coming up, you have labs, etc., right? So so your academic rigor, takes precedence, everything else takes the back seat, right? So you are kind of like a horse, you're focused on, hey, 3-1, 3-2, 4-1, 4-2, what is my subject, what is the tool or platform or programming language that I'm requested or that I'm required to learn. Let me focus on that. So you're focused on the tool, you're focused on the course, right? But you're not, if you're not taking time to connect it to the larger, to the bigger picture, then you are losing time essentially, right? When you move to the corporate, that's when reality hits, for that engineering student, because data, first of all, sometimes you have to collect it. And when you collect it, it might be messy, it can be incomplete, it can be conflicting, it can be duplicated. The problems are ambiguous. You might be given a data set that said, go figure things out, right? There can be multiple ways to a solution. There can be multiple solutions to a problem, right? So you are working with teams that have people who have different mindsets, different cultures, they speak the different languages. So there's a lot of variability in it when you are in the corporate, right? So, and more importantly, you have to make the business impact. So asking the right questions first matters, right? So one thing that you don't probably get to inculcate, and I would put it on the curriculum and the way our programs essentially have been structured, is that we are not forced to ask a question, right? Um, we know there are questions, we know there are solutions to it, and anything beyond it, hey, it's out of syllabus, right? Or it's out of curriculum. But when you move to a corporate, or when you move to a job, right? Um, a manager or a team lead can give you, as I said, give you a data set or give you a problem and said, hey, just look into this, right? So getting smart about it, right? Now, how do you ask questions that are specific, that are measurable, that are actionable, that are repeatable, that are time bound, right? You know, asking those smart questions, asking questions and turning them into solutions that are measurable, that are business relevant, you know, that gap is the one that you need to fill. And again, can AI do that? It can help you, it can augment you, but eventually you will be responsible for it, right? AI kind of replaces the repetitive work. It kind of replaces the mundane work. If you're always clicking on this, downloading it, uploading it somewhere and doing it, it can automate it, right? But you still have to understand what is it that you're downloading, what guardrails, what data quality checks, etc., that you need to put in, right? And if something doesn't happen, why didn't it happen? Is someone sick, or is a process wrong, or is there a holiday, right? There can be many situations like that. So what AI might not replace, one, it definitely will not replace accountability. Eventually, you as a person using AI, even if you're using agents or fancy agents as a part of your workflow, it's still you who's using it, right? So it will not replace accountability. It will not replace solving ambiguity, right? If you give it an ambiguous problem, what will the first thing that AI will do? It will ask you back a question, right? How many of you have used ChatGPT, right? ChatGPT, if you give it something vague, it will ask you questions, right? And that's exactly what I'm asking you to do. Ask the questions when you get something ambiguous. And then AI might not replace, stakeholder trust. So if you go to a VP and said, hey, AI gave this to me, but my intuition says this is the right answer, whom do you think the VP will trust, right? They will trust you because eventually they'll hold you accountable, for the insight. They can't hold AI accountable. They can hold someone who gave or the context to AI to come up with a solution. They'll hold them accountable essentially, right? So employers of the today or of the future, they will look for folks who do use AI, who understand AI, who understand how to use AI as a part of the workflows. So analysts who can use Copilot or ChatGPT, who can build agents, who can automate reporting, right? That's what employers are looking for. But again, don't confuse that with, oh, if Copilot or ChatGPT can do it for you, why do I need to even learn SQL? No, Copilot or ChatGPT will give you, say, a SQL statement, but you still need to be validating that. So you are the human in the loop, right? So there's nothing to fear about in terms of AI replacing jobs. We as humans are relevant. Now let's look at the more closer to your heart. The recruiters, right? What are they looking for? Look, eventually, I know, recruiters, might have like a playbook essentially. They might be looking for DSA. Again, DSA is something a lot of people talk about, a lot of people prepare for. I'm personally not a big fan of big DSA because I think it can be inculcated. Yes, understanding it, having that intuition as a student, and applying it into your solution is important. But I don't want to go through lead codes. Again, that's me personally. I'm sure everyone out there, recruiters out there, use their own way of doing things. But for me, what I look for, which is non-negotiable, is, as I said, data literacy, right? If given a data for you, can you understand it? Can you make sense of it? Can you shape it in a way where first you make sense of it and then you get me an intuition of what that data is about, right? Not just reciting syntax from memory. I don't want that. Understanding SQL is good, but using SQL to get or solve a business problem is better. Then communication, as I mentioned, are you able to communicate an insight in under 2 minutes? Again, not technical stuff, not saying, oh, I created embeddings, I put it in a vector database, using RAG, I use this specific model. If I'm a VP, I don't care, right? I care, what is the insight? So being able to explain an output or an insight to me in a non-technical language and being crisp about it, I think that is non-negotiable. Then, proof of work, don't, sure, certifications are good, but a working incomplete project is better, I would say, right? Show what you can actually build from what you have learned, right? Rather than just saying, this is what I have learned. That is more important. And then curiosity and problem solving, have you put effort in building your own portfolio, being at it consistently, right? Do you have a resume Of course, again, there are resumes out there today. Everything feels the same because everyone is using ChatGPT to or Copilot or Claude to structure them. So they all look the same. What is it that differentiates you? Projects, internship, your work on GitHub, whatever you have, checked in. What thought leadership that you have put on LinkedIn, have you volunteered somewhere, have you participated in hackathons? And more importantly, having the learner attitude, right? Grades are good, but nowadays they are not sufficient, especially someone who's starting off their career. Right? What are the some of the mistakes that student make? Right, again, choosing breadth over depth. Right, remember the T model we talked about. So it is good to understand or learn 20 tools, right? But um, go deep. So having deep understanding of SQL or Python, for example, will definitely be job well done when compared to learning 15 different tools and having certifications in all of them, right? Again, doing certificates, getting certificates without projects, right? You can collect badges, you can show them off on LinkedIn, you can get 500 likes. But if you have no end-to-end projects to show that skill for, that recruiters can actually open and show it to the recruiting manager and evaluate, those certificates are of no use. Then visibility, as I mentioned, are you putting yourself out there, whether it is through GitHub projects, whether it is through LinkedIn? If you're not out there when you search for it, that means that if your recruiter cannot find you, you don't exist, right? And starting too late. Most students think, oh, let's go to 3-2 or third year, second semester, or fourth year semester, first semester. I'll probably start then, right? Don't wait until your final year to begin, right? The best placements essentially go to students who have started early, who already know what they want or what is possible and have already tried all of these, and have started building, say, 16, 18 months prior to graduation, right? Again, there are many projects that students do, right? Again, I'm sure everyone wants to work in AI, but um, and everyone would want to showcase, hey, this is my portfolio in AI, which is good. Again, don't get me wrong, AI is good, you require to do it, but again, start small, show the breadth, right? you know just basic understanding of how to present data using, say, a sales dashboard or dashboarding, right? And then Netflix, Spotify dashboarding from a business understanding standpoint, or an e-commerce customer segmentation from data science or machine learning standpoint. Building a fraud detection system from uh, you know segmentation, or from a modeling standpoint, right? Chat with your own data. An example of, you have PDFs. Again, your college may have a lot of policies, or your where you're interning may have a lot of policies. Pull them on into a document database, into a local model, build a RAG based where you can chat with it. That's a good project to have, right? And maybe a customer support AI agents, having doing multiple agents, and you have an aggregator agent on top, right? Again, in all of these projects, again, these are good to have. Again, there are hundreds of projects and your own ideas that you can get, right? But more importantly, what makes a project stand out is, you're showcasing that, hey, this is the raw data, um, this is the insight, this is the decision. So not just a model score or a clear so what, but publish it. Show a repo. Have a dashboard. So that you can show it to someone and explain through a live demo. Again, you should be able to speak to it essentially, right? So that will beat any badge or any certification. Again, so roadmap, for third years, maybe start playing around with SQL, Excel, building that foundation. In your first semester, maybe do some Python or Power BI or Tableau, and build like a first portfolio project. Again, all of these, again, most of these are open source, or you get, say, the likes of Power BI for free for students, right? Look for opportunities to apply them, hackathons, because peer learning, community based learning is more important. Do open source contributions. If you get internships, great. take them up, get exposed to working in a company early. It can be any company, it can be any kind of role. But if you get an internship, you do take it, right? Because this is the year where you build the foundation, right? That way, your fourth year, gets spent on polishing and going more to the top of the pyramid. Remember the pyramid that we saw earlier? So going more to the top of the pyramid, right? So polish your resume, keep updating it, keep keep putting your thought leadership out there on LinkedIn, right? And again, don't just take a topic, give it to ChatGPT and copy paste the content into LinkedIn. No, that will not help you. That will not help anyone, right? You need to have an opinion. You need to have a contrasting opinion with others as well. Don't try to go with the crowd. Agree to what you feel is the right thing, right? So be yourself. And then, of course, make every piece of your work visible to recruiters or to companies who wants to hire you. Practice, practice, practice. Whether it is code, whether it is for interviews, whether it is through lead code, whether it is storytelling through data. Always practice, right? Today's world, AI skills are non-negotiable. Have at least one or two ways or tools or platforms like ChatGPT or Copilot under your skin and understand how to use them in your day-to-day workflows, right? Be the AI-enabled candidate. More importantly, I think there's a lot of people have less value to it. Put yourself out there. Go to meetups, go to hackathons, go to community events. Don't be afraid to speak up. Show up, volunteer. More importantly, it gives you a lot of hardworking hours. But speak up. Go to the stage. Reduces your stage fear essentially, right? If you have a question, be the first one to raise the hand when the speaker says any questions, right? So eventually, that will help you build that personality, to stay curious and keep building, right? No role is perfect. Titles only matter less, right? You might want to be an AI engineer, you might want to be a RAG engineer. It doesn't matter, right? It's all about the learning. Is your next role adding up to what you're adding or what you came from, where you came from, right? So continuous learning is the norm, right? So in today's world, even I need to be learning continuously, investing in myself every day. So if you're not doing that, you're getting left behind. Think about salaries, right? Again, these are very directional numbers, right? But if you look at the careers out there in terms of GCCs, right? Product companies and GCCs, they offer the fastest salary progression in Indian tech. So every role you take compounds, but that doesn't mean that you take every role every year, right? So because the learning in year two gets compounded in year three, four, right? Um, so it makes you three times more valuable in year five because you have learned a lot more, right? Again, when I say year five, this is year five of your career, not year five in the company, right? So again, you can move from associate to senior to lead to director, CDO, essentially, whatever that is, right? You move from getting your hands dirty with the data, whether it is building dashboards, going around with SQL or Python, whatever, then to a senior analyst, wherein you model ownership of tasks, you own the tasks. Then as and when you become a lead, you have people under you, you need to model their behavior, you need to guide their teams, you need to be the strategic partner, with your, higher leadership to basically start thinking about roadmaps or solutioning, right? And then at a director level, or maybe at a manager or director level, you start talking about enterprise architecture. How does the company move from point A to point B, right? What would be your data strategy look like? How can you help clients build their data strategy? So if you are focusing on the role progression one after the other, right? And think about it this, I never said promotion. It's about role progression. So progressing from one role to the other is important. So if you feel that a specific role or a company, beyond say 4 or 5 years is not moving you to the next progressed role, that means that you are staying there too long, right? So again, I'll be the first one to say that don't stay anywhere for too long. But that doesn't mean that you're moving companies every 1 2 years, because then that will show that you're not stable enough, right? My first company 4.5 years, second company 11 and a half years, third company 3 years, right? So you need to make sure that you are, because typically they say that in the fifth year is when you start being able to be more, until the fifth year you give back, you give to the company. Starting from the fifth year the company gives back to you, right? But again, it depends on the company, it depends on the role that you are focusing on, right? Again, my favorite resources, lead code, mode analytics, solve problems for SQL, do GitHub Kaggle um, projects, work with their data. Again, there is a lot of data out there that is open source. You have government data in India. You can go to gov.in, data.gov.in. There's a lot of data there that you can play around with, right? Lot of learning platforms, Microsoft Learn, Snowflake University, Coursera, YouTube, all of it is free, I would say. Especially for students, it comes at, a lot of discounted price. Lot of community out there. Hyderabad has a lot of meetup groups, PyCon for Python, HydePy, or Snowflake, or TensorFlow, or Google, or, site reliability engineering. Again, I'm throwing words out there, but you also need to understand what those mean, right? So show up, volunteer, speak, build those relationships, go beyond the classroom, speak to your other section, speak to your juniors, speak to your seniors, right? That way it helps you accelerate, build that network, and eventually the network will help you accelerate the career, right? Some things that I wish, someone told me, right? I've used SQL every single year, of my 18, 19 years old career, right? So did I focus on RDBMS? Yeah, maybe a little bit, but I wish I could have done much better in it, right? Communication separates good from the great, right? So technical skill definitely gets you a foot in the door, right? But communication determines, what happens next. How is it that you're able to convert that technical skill into a business problem, solving that business problem. Communication becomes the key, right? Chase the learning, not salary. Uh, from my personal experience, right? Money always follows when you compound your skills. And more importantly, as I mentioned, you need to reinvest in yourself. Don't be afraid to take a loan, maybe even at 5 6 years of your career, to reinvest in yourself to get maybe that master's degree, which can be online or working professional degree, right? Or don't be disheartened if your company doesn't, you know um, reimburse for a certification that you want to do. Hey, if you want to do it, do it. Make sure that you're compounding those skills. Money will follow. And then technology changes. Platforms change, every year. Tools will be obsolete every 3 to 5 years, right? But being curious, going with the crowd, listening to podcasts, reading through blogs, attending meetups or conferences, right? And more importantly, those relationships that I talked about, and the mindset to learn, to keep going, that doesn't change. Curiosity doesn't change, right? So your degree will get you the interview, your skills will build your career, but your attitude determines, how far you go, right? um so if there's one thing that I want you to do right now, if you have not already done it, know go out there, update your LinkedIn, um, install VS Code or whatever IDE that you want, set up your analytics environment, create your own GitHub account, or uh, make a check-in into it, build a repository, start checking into it, um, solve one SQL problem that you can explain, right? It can be lead code, mode analytics, it can be something local, right? So build your first analytics project this week, build one today, maybe, use Whiteboard to do it, but do it, right? Small steps aggregate over time, and that defines the trajectory of your career, right? So I leave it some time for some questions. Again, it's an open floor, ask me anything. I'm here. But again, thank you for your time. Let's connect on LinkedIn or TopMate, if you're available on that.
Thank you so much, sir, for those valuable insights. I'm sure the audience had so much learning and a lot of takeaways from today's session. Before we wrap up, I have one last question where you can share your take, and
Yep.
that is uh, what is the one bold prediction you have about the future of work, analytics, or talent for that matter, that most people are not talking about but should start preparing for right now?
Oh, one bold prediction is that we will realize that AI cannot do everything, right? And we need to be prepared for those catastrophes wherein we used AI to solve something by completely blindly trusting it. But then eventually, again, most AI projects today, for example, even though they are going to production, there's a lot of guardrails around it. But there is, I'm sure there are companies out there who are putting stuff out and they don't know what might fail. So be prepared for that, that you would need to own it. And we as people will have to make sure that we are understanding how to solve it, because AI, even though it might not always be a black box, it will still rely on you as the human to solve the problem, right? So be prepared for that.
That was quite an insight. I think we are approaching a future where human intervention is always and will be required. Thank you so much, sir, for taking your time out on a Sunday and connecting with us and sharing your decades full of experience for our early career professionals. It was great having you with us on this session of Sunday with SketchBrains in collaboration with Task. Thank you for joining in, sir. Thank you so much for our audience for listening patiently. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm here for any questions.
Okay, so we have one more question. The question is that companies often talk about hiring talent, but what responsibilities do company have in building talent?
Yeah, good question, right? You have to meet in the middle, right? So the candidates or people can, or students can do so much to upskill themselves, but what are companies doing, or what can companies do? I think companies are doing a lot. First of all, of course, they are placing their bets on you. That's definitely one aspect that you will help them grow. But I think a lot of companies today out there, they provide opportunities for learning, opportunities for career growth. If you want to do a certification or attend a conference, etc., they are available for that. They are open for that. A lot of companies talk about wellness of employees, so they all know that there is burnout that folks, especially on the junior level, may have. So, wellness programs, etc., they invest in a lot of that. You will see companies, who might give some wellness day off just so that um, employees can regenerate. And more importantly, I think companies are investing in folks in today's world by giving them access to AI. Right? They don't have to do it, but they are doing it, not because everyone else is doing it, but because they feel that there is value to it. Right? So uh, tokenomics, if you talk about it, I think today's AI native companies, I think we talk about roti, kapda, makan, and tokens, right? So including salary and equity, I think nowadays most companies are also saying, hey, we'll give you whatever cloud max, or this much dollar amount of tokens that you could use in your monthly budget, for instance, right? So companies do understand that they need to reinvent, and I think they are trying to meet employees in the middle.
Well said, sir. Roti, kapra, makan, and tokens. We have one last question here. The question is that you mentioned there are hundreds of job openings, in fact, thousands of job openings, I must say, every year. But Still, freshers and early career professionals are struggling to find jobs. So, is there a misalignment between colleges and corporate expectations?
Yeah, I would say yes. As I mentioned, there is, how do you fill that gap essentially, right? Earlier, I think it was very, I wouldn't say easy. Even earlier, we had the same challenges. Nowadays, entry level become a lot more challenging because AI can do most of the entry level tasks that were being there earlier, right? So that is why you need to stay ahead of the curve, because what got an entry level fresher job 10 years ago will not get them a job today, right? Because as I said, you know agents can do, I would say, 80% of the job that a fresher can do, right? But what does that mean for the freshers? That so they need to stay forward, saying that, look, if AI can do this, this is what I can make AI do, right? And that becomes important, right? And you need to be able to articulate that, showcase that um, through your projects, to your talks, or through whatever experience that you have to do, through whatever internship that you take up, or through showing through the interviews, etc. Right? So as I mentioned, the gap is real because the industry moves at a much faster pace than curriculum does, right? So you need to, or students need to bridge that gap through whatever we talked about today, and that will still put them above the average student, but above that average student still is a pool, right? So you need to be having that unique differentiator that only you know what that is, right? Because you come with your own unique background, and you need to be the one. So as I said, don't go with the crowd, find out what defines you, and that's the personality that you need to get out there in front of a recruiter. That's the only thing that sells. Only you will sell.
Very well said, sir. I think in today's session, we really heard experience married with relevance. Thank you so much, sir. That sums all of the questions up. Thank
Thank you so
you.
much.
Thank you for sharing your insights and decades full of experience and knowledge with our learners and students watching across Telangana. Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thanks
everyone.
everyone, have a nice afternoon.